This is Find Your Dream Job, the podcast that helps you get hired, have the career you want, and make a difference in life. I'm your host, Mac Pritchard. I'm also the founder of Mac's List. It's a job board in the Pacific Northwest that helps you find a fulfilling career. Every Wednesday, I talk to a different expert about the tools you need to find the work you want. Our show is sponsored by Top Resume. Upload your resume today for a free review by one of Top Resume's expert writers. Go to maxlist.org/topresume. Organizational culture ranks as a top concern for job seekers. But how do you find a company that puts employees first? Here to talk about this is Katie Augsburger. She's the founding partner and employee experience strategist for Future Work Design. Katie has been creating and implementing successful human resources programs for more than 15 years. She joins us today from Portland, Oregon. Katie, let's start here. What do you mean when you talk about a company that puts employees first?
When I think about an organization that centers the needs of employees, that's what I think about when I say putting employees first. That really puts them in the center of how they design the work experience.
And what does that look in practical terms? I mean, it doesn't sound like we're talking about money and benefits. So those, of course, are important. How do you see that in a day-to-day experience as an employee?
Yeah, well, often when we think about the employee experience, we think about onboarding and compensation and all of these individual moments in an employee life cycle. And when you really put this employee in the center of those needs, it's like, what does that employee need to feel whole, to feel that they're having their best career, that they're cared for, that they feel connected with the organization and their coworkers. And so that really looks at having a holistic approach to the employee experience and recognizing that there's many different needs. And dependent on that person's identity, there might be some additional barriers that may exist for an employee. So it's about really looking at their experience holistically.
When you think about those barriers, what kind of obstacles come to mind for companies that do both identify and remove those barriers? What kind of obstacles are they removing?
Yeah, it can be really different for very different employees. But an example is if you're a working parent, what will make you the most successful employee? Often that might look like having a robust leave policy. Maybe that means flexible start and stop times. That also might look like a really great health benefits package. And to recognize that different employees have different needs, but when you center employees that have a lot of barriers based on either their family status, their racial identity, their gender, that when you center the people with the most barriers, you actually get an experience that benefits everyone. So that's what I look for when I look for an organization that is a great employee-first company.
How do employers who are successful at doing this come up with a program that serves the needs of, as you say, so many different people? Because it must be complex. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution, is it?
No, and I actually use an example from history that I think helps illustrate ways organizations can do this well. So in 1945 in Michigan, when soldiers were returning from war and they had mobility issues, there was a movement to start creating cutouts inside of sidewalk curbs so that they could move between streets easy. And what they found is that the small accommodation for this group, the small group that wasn't the majority of the population, but it actually benefited everybody. Everybody benefited when they made this small accommodation. So when I work with employers, I help them identify ways that they can make something for somebody who has the most barriers that will benefit everybody. So an example is a maternity-paternity policy, which on its surface is often for working mothers who are returning to work after having a child. But when you actually implement it to the greatest benefit of all employees, that helps everyone who is a working parent. Or if you do something like flexible stop and start times, that makes life easier for all sorts of people, not just people who are most impacted.
When you work with employers, Katie, to create these policies, what are the kinds of questions you encourage managers to ask of their employees in order to get clear about what people's needs are?
Well, the first thing you said is exactly what I asked them to do, is to ask questions. Because what often happens is employers want to predict what employees need. And especially if you don't share the same identity of the employee. For example, if you are a white manager talking to a staff that's predominantly Latinx and you're trying to predict what their needs are, you may get it really wrong. And so it's important to ask, what are the barriers you have to working and being successful here? What are things that I can help move and build for you? And where are areas in which you're struggling or finding great success that we can capitalize on that success and remove the barriers on the struggles?
What kinds of obstacles do you see both employers and employees face when they go through this kind of process to get clear about those barriers and identify solutions?
Yeah, often some of the things that lock organizations up is a sense of we've always done it this way, where it's like, this is the way it's always been done. So doing something different can feel like anarchy or can feel like lawlessness, and can be very confusing and without structure. So that often is the first hurdle for us to get through, is that there can be a new way of working that is different, but doesn't mean it is wrong or problematic. The other thing that people often worry first and foremost is cost. How expensive is this change going to be? Which is a very rational and reasonable thing to worry about. But what we find is that often those costs um, aren't actually real. They're imagined. They're feared, but they're not actually realized. And there's usually a huge cost savings by implementing things that help the employees stay in their role and be successful and grow.
Can you talk more about the savings that result from adopting these employee first policies?
Yeah, a great example is career paths. So when we take time to invest in training and development for employees, creating career paths that are clear, promoting, we have longevity with our employees, which we have really good data that if we keep employees and grow them, that is a net benefit to the organization over turn and churn and rehire. And the cost to rehire and train is very expensive. So when we actually put the dollars into investing in the staff that's there, particularly staff from marginalized communities that may have not had historical access to those roles, we see a huge return on that investment. But that usually means upfront costs that you don't get to see realized for a year or two or three.
As the economy worsens, do you think employers will be more resistant to adopting policies that put employees first?
I was pretty fearful of that when this all started to happen. That the first thing that we would see is just a return of some pretty uh, money focused and not people focused solutions to problems. And what I'm finding is actually the opposite. I think what we're seeing now in this humanity crisis is a need and a reaching back to what makes organizations great, which is the people. What we're missing right now most is people connection. And so I'm seeing a real shining light in how many organizations are connecting with their employees, even when they're having to make hard decisions. And an example that I just saw today was Airbnb is doing a pretty large layoff where 25% of their staff is impacted. And the letter that the CEO sent out about how they're going to care for these impacted employees and how they're going to reimagine their strategy is a real kind of master class in how we can do this well and still center humanity in our employment decisions.
I'm glad you brought that example up because I think some listeners might imagine, well, a company that puts employees first, that's something you can afford in the good times, but that is going to get jettisoned during tougher times. But it sounds like you're not seeing that.
No, and that doesn't mean putting employees first doesn't mean that we always bring in ping pong tables and beer pong, right? Like it means that we put them in the center of our design even when we're making hard decisions. So when the decision is difficult, like we're going to have to make a layoff, we're actually centering those employees' needs. What information do they need? How much caretaking do we give them and the people who are not impacted? How do we communicate to the communities? How do we ensure that we're being equitable in our decision making? How do we ensure that the right people are involved in that decision making? Even in those really tough decisions, centering those employees' needs and how to care for them is mission critical.
We've talked about policies and practices and the benefits both to an employer and workers of these practices. What about values? How important are they in a company that puts employees first?
Yeah, this is where as a job seeker, this is so important to find an organization that aligns with your values. And I don't necessarily mean like surface level values. I mean deep values of like connection, what you care about, transparency, fairness or equity. Like, what are the things that mean the most to you? Because you may find that in a company you were not expecting to find that. And so organizations practice these values very differently, and they may on the surface talk a lot about how they value one thing, and it might not show up in their practices. So to really look deeply of like, how is this showing up? And so to use the example of an organization that's very transparent, when they make tough decisions, how are they communicating that? Where is that showing up? And how much information do I get about that? So that helps me understand that when things are good, I can trust that organization to maybe share those benefits if we have a great quarter, or that I'll have a better understanding of like how my work impacts the bottom line.
Well, I want to take a break, Katie. And when we come back, I want to talk about how to find these companies, especially when you're doing a job search. So stay with us. When we return, Katie Augsburger will continue to share her advice on how to find a company that puts employees first. Understanding what it's like to work for an employer is a fundamental part of any job search. And so is having an effective resume. But many of us struggle with how to talk about ourselves and our accomplishments. Does this sound like you? If you need help telling your career story, sign up today for a free review of your resume by our show sponsor, Top Resume. Go to maxlist.org/top resume. Within 2 business days, a professional writer at Top Resume will give you a personal evaluation of your resume. You'll get specific suggestions about your resume's format, the language you use, and what to do to get past the dreaded application tracking systems. Go to maxlist.org/top resume. Now, let's be candid. A resume alone won't get you your next job. You'll also have to invest time in research, interview preparation, and follow-up. But a well-written resume will get you more interviews and get the job you want faster. Find out today how to make your resume better. Go to maxlist.org/top resume. Now, let's get back to the show. We're back in the Max List studio. I'm talking with Katie Augsburger. She's the founding partner and employee experience strategist for Future Work Design. Excuse me, Katie. Before the break, we were talking about how to find a company that puts employees first. And so put yourself in the shoes of a job seeker. Katie, how do you recommend someone get started in finding firms like this?
Yeah, The thing I recommend to friends and colleagues first is to be clear about your own personal values, that you need to understand what is important to you first and foremost. And sometimes we can kind of get, just like any consumer, dazzled by the organizations that have the best marketing, that sound the best on paper, but those aren't always going to give you the most um, you know, generous benefits, the most exciting career, or even the deepest connection with your colleagues. So, to look at organizations that really speak to what is interesting to you and what your core values are.
Is there a simple exercise or perhaps a short list of questions you recommend someone ask themselves to get clear about those values?
Oh yeah. So one of the things I like to ask an organization is how their stated values show up in the day to day. So often an organization will say we're compassionate, and I like to drill deep and say, okay, well, what does that look like to you? How do you practice that value? And that might seem like kind of an interesting question to ask. When it becomes that part of the interview process for you to ask questions, but it allows you to see how those values show up in a way that is meaningful as opposed to something that's just on their wall in their lobby. So if transparency is a value, give me an example of how you practice transparency in your organization. Does that show up in your compensation system? Are you transparent about your pay? Does compassion live in how you do your benefits program or how you offer your paid time off? Those are really great indicators if we're living the values that we state.
I love those questions. I have to ask though, as a candidate, do you jeopardize your application by asking what questions that might make a manager uncomfortable?
I think that's a really good tell. If you ask questions about an organization's values and that makes them uncomfortable, for me that might not be an organization that would be that there'd be a misalignment there between me and them, because I want an organization for me that can answer some difficult questions, even in that new beginning phase. I liken it a lot to any time we're meeting a new person or creating a new connection in our life, whether that be like a friendship or a romantic partner. If we can't ask even very simple questions about how you work, how you value, what you care about, that's a bit of a flag.
In addition to asking questions like these during interviews, any other steps you recommend a candidate take, perhaps before an interview, to get clear about whether a company puts its employees first or not?
Yeah, I like to to say that the honeymoon is not the marriage when it comes to interviewing. When we first meet an employer, often they tell us a lot of things that are there to attract us to the organization, but might say very little about what is there to retain us. And so the honeymoon is great. You can have a great honeymoon, but you want to be with an organization, my assumption is, for much longer than just those first few months. And so, what is those retention policies? What do we do to retain our employees long term? And that would look like, what are your career paths? What does your retirement program look like? Um, the the benefits that are often very short term are kind of those small tangible items, like maybe a travel perk or movie benefits, or sometimes those are like the fun perks that we often read about in organizations. But I like to ask, what is the average tenure in your organization? How long do people stay here? That gives me really good information about how often people grow in an organization and how well they're valued.
Some organizations are small. There's no place to go because there are just a handful of positions other than out. How do you recommend someone trying to understand the career path of people who preceded them in at that organization? If people move on, is that a good or a bad sign?
I think it's always a good sign if there's a connection still kept with the organization. So there's nothing wrong with short tenure, and there's nothing wrong with people not developing into new roles if that's how the organizational structure is made. But there needs to be some storytelling around that so that I can understand why that is. And to your point, in small organizations where lateral growth is impossible, what does vertical growth look like? Where can I grow in ways that give me more skill, maybe give me more responsibility, maybe expose me to new ideas, but might not mean that I'm managing employees or growing upwards, but I might be growing out. So how does that look? And then how am I connected to the organization if I decide to move to a career that's outside?
You mentioned earlier asking questions about benefits. Uh, Talk to us about timing, Katie. The conventional advice is don't have a conversation about vacation or other benefits until an offer is on the table. How do you recommend timing the questions you mentioned earlier?
I think those conversations happen when those compensation conversations happen, which is when we've had time to get to know the role, get to know the manager, and I'm getting close to making a decision. But before I sign and make that decision final, I need to know more about how you operate. And I think that also gives the organization that vetting time as well to make sure that they are prepared to answer some of those questions in more depth because they're already invested in you as a candidate. And I think what's really great about having those conversations towards the end of the interview cycle is you may have enough information to really fine tune those questions. And some of those questions may have already been answered for you in the way they've talked about the organization so far.
We've talked about the candidate asking lots of questions of the employer about values and policies and practices. What should a candidate expect a manager or a hiring manager, rather, to ask them about their own professional values and career paths?
Yeah, as a person who's done a lot of interviews, I really like to ask questions about how people show up for their colleagues and how they how resilient they are when mistakes happen. So those for me are really important signals of your ethics and values in times of stress. So if I hear conversation in the interview process in which I don't feel you're very loyal to the absent, meaning you're not only driving the bus over somebody, but you're driving backwards and forwards over somebody in a conversation about where a mistake was made, that indicates to me that maybe we're going to have a misalignment in values. Same is true with how you talk about a project or a project or a process that did not go well. I I look for people to show resiliency in these conversations because in organizations and just in the world, even this moment is a great example. We will face crisis, and it's important to me to look for people who can manage through crisis and are looking to be of service and help during difficult times.
I'm glad you brought up the example of a manager who might speak ill of someone else who had been there in the past, because certainly candidates are always coached never speak ill of a past employer, no matter how legitimate the complaint might be. And it's a good sign for candidates to keep an eye out for too, isn't it? If you hear a hiring manager or an employer trash talk someone.
Absolutely. And it's a great thing to ask why a position is open. That might give you a window to if that manager is going to do exactly what you said. If I ask, is this a new position or an open role? Is this an open role or a role that has been recently vacated? You may get some information about the departing employee. And if you find that that information is a bit of a roll of the bus over somebody, that's an indication that maybe that won't be an organization that you'll feel very excited to work for.
As part of your homework and researching a company, do you recommend talking to past or current employees about the company's values and practices?
Absolutely, but know that sometimes you're going to get information that might not always be relevant to your experience because often the manager plays a bigger role. And so if you're not going to be in the same reporting structure, that might not be as relevant, but it may give you a good window to the organization. The best questions to ask an employee that's current or departed is around their policies and practices. So those aren't necessarily manager specific, but give you a lot of information about how the company values their employees.
Often when an offer's on the table, you might receive a copy of the employee handbook, as well as perhaps other policies and practices from the firm. How do you recommend a candidate use those documents in making decisions about whether this indeed is a company that puts employees first?
Yeah, I know people find employee handbooks pretty tedious to read. And as a person that reads a lot, and I will be reading some today, they can be, but they tell you such important information about the values of the organization. And so if you're reading through that handbook and you see policies or practices for groups that you do not belong, groups from marginalized communities where you can see that they're centering their needs, that's a really good signal that this organization has done deep work in creating an employee experience that matters for everybody. So I look for that inside of handbooks. Where have we created signals, policies, and practices that really reach out to those who've had the most historical barriers and creates an organization in which they'll be cared for? Because regardless of my identity, it signals to me that they have done some deep work and that I will be cared for.
Katie, it's been a terrific conversation. Tell us what's next for you.
Oh, well, I am doing consulting with our team, Future Work Design, and actually kind of enjoying the extra at-home time with my kiddo.
That's terrific. Well, I know people can learn more about your company by visiting your website. That's www.futurework.design. We'll include that URL in the show notes as well. Now, Katie, given all the great advice you've shared today, what's the one thing you want a listener to remember about how to find a company that puts its employees first?
Yeah, that this is a difficult time, and it feels like that you should probably just take whatever job that you can get, or that you should be thankful for whatever position you can find. But there are great employers out there that want great employees that are going to caretake for you and make sure that they can have the best career for you. So don't be discouraged by hard times. It just might mean that that look is a little harder.
Your resume is one of your most important career tools. But if you're not sure about what to include or leave off your resume, Top Resume can help. Sign up today for a free resume review. Go to maxlist.org/top resume. Do you like this podcast? Subscribe to our free weekly newsletter. Every Wednesday, we'll send you links to job search resources mentioned in the interview and an episode transcript. Go to maxlist.org/podcasts. Again, that's maxlist.org/podcast. Next week, our guest will be Nick Korkodilis. He's the host of AskTheHeadhunter.com, where he has answered more than 50,000 questions from job seekers and employers. Nick says the biggest job search mistake he sees people make is applying everywhere. Instead, you should chase companies, not jobs, says Nick, and build relationships with employers before you apply. He and I will talk about how to choose your target companies and why doing so will get you a better job. I hope you'll join us. Until next time, thanks for letting us help you find your dream job.